finding new identities for ourselves to go against the identities that were being given to us by the oppressor. So we move into the 20th century. And through the 20th century, we start having a lot of fun with the myth. So I'm going to read a little bit now from that. The 20s through the 50s. Black music and the creation of the modern music industry, the jazz age, classic blues, funky gospel, Tin Pan Alley, rhythm and blues, from Duke Ellington to Sun Ra. Now I'm going to start with a quote by a couple of people who first heard the new music that was coming up out of the field hollers and the blues and the just groove out of Congo Square, which was suddenly being called jazz. This is Anne Faulkner. She said, jazz was a destructive dissonance, asking if the music put the word sin in syncopation. Henry Van Dyke, who described jazz as an unmitigated cacophony, a species of music invented by demons for the torture of imbeciles. That was how jazz was being described in the early 20th century by those who were threatened by it. So why were they threatened by this music? Because their children were loving it. Does that sound familiar? They saw it as the worst form of music that had ever come out, and it needed to be destroyed. So a lot of times we can get very critical of a lot of music we hear today, understood that a lot of black music went through the same growing pains. Now, going back to Sidney Bechet. Sidney says of the jazz, the spirituals and the blues were a prayer. One was praying to God while the other was praying to what was human. It's like you were saying, oh God, let me go. And the other was saying, oh mister, let me be. And they were both the same thing in a way. They were both my people's way of praying to themselves. They had a kind of trance to themselves, a kind of forgetting. It was like a man closing his eyes so he can see a light inside himself. That light, it's far off and you got to wait to see it, but it's there. It's waiting. The spirituals. They're a way of seeing you through it. And the blues, they got the sob inside of them, that awful lonesome feeling. It's got so much remembering inside it, so many bad things to remember, so many things that have been lost. That's Sidney Bechet talking about jazz. Now, when they said his biography was unreliable, they didn't understand what he was trying to do. He was trying to document, to the best of his ability, where this feeling came from that became this music we call jazz. Now I'm calling the next section, hoodoo goes pop, jazz goes hot, and R&B goes doo-wop. So let me read from that. Southern blacks migrated in droves to the northern cities to escape the Jim Crow South and seek better opportunities. The musicians were among them, only to be met in the northern cities by segregated neighborhoods and hoodlums, searching for new affirming identities of self, bringing with them the dozens wordplay, bringing with them the blues and the folk traditions embedded in them, bringing with them hoodoo mysticism and Southern Christian folk sermons, or as some would say, Jesus rode north with a black cat in his lap. The Harlem Renaissance connected to the negritude movement of colonial Africans. African American musicians were performing in clubs mainly named after Southern plantations, what a lot of people tend to forget. All the best clubs where we were performing were Cotton Club, Plantation Club, Old Plantation Club, Virginia Plantation Club. What was going on there? The owners of those clubs were mainly whites, and they wanted to make sure we understood that even with this great music they loved, we were in our place entertaining them. Don't think of this music as something serious, something spiritual. And we had to combat that. The Harlem Renaissance connecting us, like I said, to the negritude of colonial Africans, African American musicians performing in clubs named after Southern plantations and slave era nostalgia being asked to perform stereotyped African jungle themes in the music with instruments making so-called jungle sounds had to be countered, and they were, by artists like Duke Ellington's jazz symphonic suites, such as Black, Brown, and Beige. That was a direct response to him having to perform these racialized tunes in those clubs. He said, don't just look at this music as entertaining. Our history is kept in this music. And through suites like Black, Brown, and Beige, he actually tried to create a musical narrative for the history of Black America up until the time he was working. And he did that his whole life. That was something he constantly went back to and tried to work on. Through the musical mythology of the South, the blues, the work songs, the field songs, came this folk symphonic music called jazz. But also something new started to come about in the 20s and 30s during the Harlem Renaissance. You had certain mythic and cultural and religious groups starting to come about. You had groups like the Moorish Science Temple settling in Chicago. You had Marcus Garvey's Negro Improvement Association laying the foundation for future Black nationalist organizations. And you had the reemergence of African pride in the African American populace. These and other esoteric spiritual groups began to assert influence on the Black population in major northern cities such as Chicago and New York. Identity remixing and self-mythologizing to counter Jim Crow and Northern right racism. Paul Robeson giving Black manhood a boost with his presence. All these things going on. Harlem Renaissance, post-Harlem Renaissance. So, you have Duke Ellington, Count Basie, and all these artists laying the foundations for jazz. You have Billie Holiday and her divine voice laying the foundations for jazz as this art form to be taken seriously. Now, when you start integrating groups like the Moorish Science Temple, like Marcus Garvey's UNIA, and later groups like the Nation of Islam, something begins to change in the music as well, in the jazz. You also have Black musicians who have gone off to fight in World War II, who have coming back and experienced the world and bringing back with them certain traditions from the Far East, like Buddhism, like yoga. All these other traditions that a lot of times in the southern United States and in the northern ghettos and in the northern suburbs, we just weren't thinking about those things. We weren't thinking about this way we could change ourselves, expand our religious views, expand our spiritual selves. But that was all beginning to change in the 30s, 40s, and 50s with the Harlem Renaissance, with World War II, with coming back and wanting to assert our freedom, assert ourselves. The jazz began to change. It became more forceful. It became more serious. It moves away from being just dance music. Something starting to change. So out of this milieu, you come one of my crossroad characters in music. His name is Herman Blount. That's when he was born. Anybody know what I'm talking
Sun
about?
Ra.
Sun Ra. Who are familiar with Sun Ra? Great. One of my favorites of all time. What makes Sun Ra so important? Well, he's a student of the tradition. The field hollers, the blues, the early jazz, especially coming out of New Orleans and Louis Armstrong. He loved Duke Ellington. But he also loved something that was beyond what was being presented to him. The idea that he could be a free person in the universe. And how was he going to affect that change in himself and in others? Well, he decided I would no longer be a Black Southerner oppressed in Jim Crow America. I would become what? Anybody? A Nubian from? Yeah. He said he was from Saturn, but one of his song titles was Nubian from Plutonia. So here's a Black man in the 1950s who's decided he's no longer a human being, but a cosmic being. And not only he's going to decide that, he's actually going to create a jazz band that puts out the philosophy. Now, a lot of people, when he came out, especially many of the Yo's in jazz who were kind of stayed in touch, they're like, this man is on the fringes. He's a little crazy. What is he talking about? He wasn't crazy. He was coming out of a tradition of change, especially having been based in Chicago for many years, basically living beside the Nation of Islam, living beside the Moorish Science Temple. You have these alternative Christian organizations like the Urantia Group putting out books about the cosmic history of the universe, and we coming from the motherships, and we're coming from planes of existence outside the universe, multiple universes. He's soaking all this in. He says, I can get with that. I can transform. I can be that. I don't have to be limited to this Black self being oppressed in America. I can be who I want to be, who I will myself to be. And so he creates his avatar, Sun Ra. And he creates a group of jazz musicians and brings them into his philosophy, and he calls them what? The orchestra. Oh, wow, orchestra. Why the ark? What is the ark? Let's go back to the Ark of the Covenant in the Bible. We often look at the text And we get a little scared when we play with it. But let's understand, the art was what? It was this box made out of gold and wood and cedar and insulation, and it contained what? The voice of God. So it was like a spiritual boom box. That's what it was. It was a sound system. It was a speaker that contained the voice of God. So Sun Ra saw that concept. He said, I'm going to create an orchestra because I see jazz as that art now. I see it being able to basically take these conceptual ideas that I have, wrap them up in a sound that's both ancient and futuristic, and move forward with it. And I'm going to call all you to come along with me. And when I have a concert, I'm going to ask you to basically dance in the rituals. I'm going to ask you to participate in the movements. This is not just a jazz concert. It's a Afro-Kemetic futurist sermon. And he was able to do that. And he was able to do it well for almost 30 years. And he was able to keep those musicians in his band together, which is very remarkable. And he was able to do that because they believed in what he was trying to do. It wasn't that they just fully accepted all the philosophy. They understood what he was trying to do. He was trying to break free of the barriers that we have been put in this country. And the music was the vehicle that did that, more so than anything else. So Sun Ra comes out with that. And it's almost like a spiritual civil rights movement. Coinciding with what? The civil rights movement really taking full shape in the 50s and 60s, when we're really pushing hard for our freedom. And we're finding ways to speak to that through the music. So suddenly we have artists and musicians who are saying, we must take a stand. And we must take this mythic music and move forward and find a way to use the technology and get our voices out. So suddenly you have Max Roach, We Insist, Freedom Now Suite, with Abby Lincoln screaming over the instruments with her own vocal leads, basically trying to encapsulate the pain and our suffering and our frustration of not yet having freedom in the land of the free. So you have people beginning to once again see this music as something more than just entertainment. It is a vehicle to move forward American freedom and American mythic self. All that's happening at the same time, the R&B music, which is coming out of the jazz and blues tradition in the 50s, doo-wop music, this beautiful vocalizing where you have these 4 or 5 or 6 part harmonies melding together to just kind of transport and transform your soul and hit you in ways you've never been hit with music. But all this connecting to its older traditions as well. Now out of the doo-wop, you have the contemporary R&B music coming about, you have the Motown sound coming about, you have all these traditions coming about. But you also have, once again, those alternative mystical traditions informing people in different ways they can basically present their information. So you have free jazz. You have John Coltrane pushing the envelope of jazz, having basically taken that Eastern walk with it, taking Eastern mysticism way beyond where it probably thought it was going to go with his jazz saxophone playing. You have his wife Alice Coltrane creating this symphonic merging of Eastern with the Western jazz to create these symphonic layers of sound. Then you also have people like Jimi Hendrix coming about, creating what I call sci-fi, space fantasy, hoodoo blues. David Henderson, who wrote the book Excuse Me Why I Kissed the Sky on Jimi Hendrix, the original title of the book was Voodoo Child of the Aquarian Age. They changed the title when it came from Europe and got here to America. They said it was just too avant-garde. What do you mean he's a voodoo child of the Aquarian Age? What was David Henderson, who was one of the founding poets of Umbra, trying to say with this? He was trying to say there is a new age coming not just for white Europeans, hippies, but there is a new age coming for blacks as well, who were living the hippie life, but we just couldn't call ourselves hippies. We had to call ourselves something else or be something else, but we were right there with them. We wouldn't call what we were doing free love, but we were feeling the same urges. And Jimi Hendrix was basically encapsulating that. Somebody who had come up playing on the Chitlin circuit with Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, playing with various blues musicians. And you know, we see the Jimi Hendrix that became the rock and roll star, but he earned his chops. And he earned his chops, but he also said he was confined by it. He had to create this mythic being who you saw on stage, who was taking the blues to outer space. So taking cues from Sun Ra, Jimi Hendrix was moving forward as well. Now at the time this is happening, you have Caribbean pop music going from basically songs like My Lollipop, suddenly turning into something like ska, suddenly turning into something like reggae. Why is it turning into that? Because you have this philosophy of Rastafarianism coming in and saying you can put a message in the music once again. And when you put a message in the music has to change. When you put myth in the music has to correspond to the ancestors, and those ancestors call you to do certain things in the music. So suddenly you have some potent music coming out of Jamaica, the likes of which nobody had ever heard before. And not only do you have the artists, Bob Marley, of course, being the greatest example, but you had so many that were just as potent, just as powerful, who were taking on the Rastafarian tradition. And basically, I will call it the myth. And when I say myth, I'm not talking about make-believe. I'm talking about ancestral knowledge, the myth itself, and projecting that African past into this futuristic sound. Now, when a lot of people think of reggae, they call it roots music. I beg to differ, because out of reggae music came some of the most sonic innovations you can name that we're still using today. What we have dub reggae coming out. Now that's where I really get into it, because here is dub reggae, and what is it? You're taking the version of the song, and you're saying I can play with this. So you have people like King Tubby practically creating reggae because he's an electrical engineer, saying, if I create this thing here, I can fade sound in, I can fade sound out, I can reverb, I can echo, and I can create this architectural space with sound that envelops you. It's almost like you're walking through something, and spatially it's like you're walking in space. And Lee Scratch Perry, who was one of the most profound progenitors and creators of the reggae traditions through dub, said of it, I was trying to put the ghost of the ancestors back into the machines. Wow. So what does he call his studio? The Black Ark Studio. Once again, the word ark comes about. Why? Because, once again, like Sun Ra, he understood that that biblical ark was a sound system, and that he wanted to name his studio the Black Ark Studio because he saw it as a sound system projecting Jah's message. Now, many of the music that came out there, some of it was great, some of it was good, okay, some of it was terrible sometimes, but it was the concept behind what was motivating it that was very important to them. This idea that they could be free in this music. Now, what's important about all of this is the fact that a lot of times African Americans gravitated to the music for financial reasons. We couldn't make a multi-million-dollar sci-fi movie or fantasy movie, but we could make a record and live in that fantasy world that we created through music and sound and verb and words. So that lays the foundation for what in the 70s, after the reggae, after Jimi Hendrix, you got somebody like P-Funk coming in. Ultimate crossroads figures. Sun Ra begets Hendrix, Hendrix begets P-Funk. We'll talk about who they beget. But Parliament Funkadelic, amazing. What makes them so incredible is the fact that they had this incredible artist running with them named Pedro Bell. Who all knows Pedro Bell? He's the one who did all the album covers for Parliament Funkadelic. Still alive. In not great health, but he's still trying to do things. And he was the one, along with George Clinton, who was coming up with the concepts behind the Parliament Funkadelic aesthetic, that P-Funk mythology. And when a lot of people look at the mythology of P-Funk, you have to understand that people were waiting for something like that. We couldn't go to movies and see ourselves doing what they were doing on those album covers, but we could buy that album cover and we could live in it. It was like early forms of graphic novels, if you ask me. It was our comic books, you know. We didn't see ourselves often in the mass media, but in the P-Funk universe, you could be a cosmic slopper, you could be a space cadet, you could be a Black Flash Gordon, you could be all those, you could be this ghetto-wise version of whatever, or you could be whatever you wanted to be in this universe that was being created. So they created a mythology around themselves that to this day is still very potent. I still run across, my uncle was a P-Funkster, as he called himself. He was one, I mean, he had all the albums. He went to all the concerts, no matter how far they were, he'd drive somewhere to go. And he'd come back telling me all these stories. So as a child, I'm growing up and I'm just looking at the album covers and I'm drawing them as an artist and I'm embodying all this information. And I'm just loving hearing him describe his universe that he basically wanted to be in. And so you have bands like Parliament Funkadelic, but then you also have what I call the tween version, Earth, Wind, and Fire. And the reason I call them the clean version is because with P-Funk, they had Pedro Bell and other artists doing this incredible artwork in sync with the band. Earth, Wind, and Fire really didn't have that. They actually had an A&R department who would say, artists, this is the music, talk to them about the concept, can you create something? So even though Earth, Wind, and Fire was very close to the art and could describe the concepts they wanted, it was actually up to the artists to create those final products. But man, were they incredible. Pyramids turning into techno spaceships. Once again, merging the African past with the Afro future in the present. Coming up with these new age philosophies that are also based on Kwanzaa, that are also based on Swahili, Zulu culture, African black consciousness, and the Black Power movement being distilled through the music. All this is coming about through Earth, Wind, and Fire. So like I said, P-Funk was more of the red light district version of black mythology. Earth, Wind, and Fire was the one that basically you could play for everybody. You have that going on. Now, with Parliament Funkadelic and the aesthetic they create around the music and the mythology they create around the music, they have a very big influence on the generations coming after them. But there were others working as well. You had groups like the Barcades. Now, how many of you seen the Watt Stax concert film? Where it's basically that wonderful concert that takes place in Los Angeles years ago, where they brought basically the Stax label to Watts and performed. That's where Public Enemy got most of It Takes a Nation of Millions samples from, that one concert. So you have groups like the Barcades at that time, and I recommend seeing the film because what I loved about the film was the costuming. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question. Because,
yeah.
A few weeks ago in the Central Library, I saw Otis Redding's documentary.
Yes.
And the Barcades were on that plane with him when he crashed in Madison, Wisconsin. So were they a collective, or did somebody else take the concept?
Yeah, they were a collective, and there were some musicians who weren't on the plane, and they basically had to go and recruit new musicians to replace those who died in that plane crash with Otis Redding. So the Barcades I'm talking about was the second reincarnation of the Barcades, because the originals did die in that plane with Otis Redding.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. But looking at the Watt Stax footage, I was just thrown by the costumes they were wearing when they came on stage. And anybody who remembers the costume, look at this. You know, that was some funky stuff. They were like, I said, you didn't know if they were trying to say, once we were slaves and now we are free? Because they all had these big chains on. They all had the chains on their feet, the chains on, you're talking about ropes. But then they had the funky tassels and all the other stuff. So you're thinking of the Hendrix influence. You're thinking of the Agungun costumes in Africa, these dance quilts. So you have all this going on. And you realize that not only were the Barcades and Parliament Funkadelic and Earth, Wind, and Fire, but many of the bands coming out of the late 60s and early 70s, being influenced by the civil rights movement and the black consciousness movement, there was a certain aesthetic they wanted to present. An aesthetic that basically was the aesthetic of freedom. So when I looked at the movie Django Unchained, and you saw when the man asked him, wear whatever clothes you want to wear, he picked out that Fauntleroy Blue Boy suit, you realize he wanted to basically be as expressive as he wanted to be. I'm free to do what I want. Why can't I wear this? Why can't I indulge my greatest fantasy in the clothes I wear? Heck, you won't let me do this. You won't let me see myself in the movie like this. But 60s and 70s, things are changing. We're starting to make movies. We're starting to put our aesthetic on screen. Whites are trying to co-opt it with blaxploitation, but we're still fighting to hold on to it. Marvin Gaye is coming out with the What's Going On, one, touchstone albums of all time. You have basically black music once again fueling this mythic need for ourselves to self-identify and recreate. So, Parliament Funkadelic, Earth, Wind, and Fire, 70s. You have also the OJs coming out of Philly with the Philly sound, Gamble and Huck, McFadden and Whitehead, this symphonic funk. And they're creating an aesthetic as well. And they're creating these beautiful protest albums, the OJs are. You have the Delphonics creating this, what I call dub-influenced Afro-American R&B, where you have the echo and the reverb, and it sounds like they're coming from these different spatial realms with their voices. This falsettos that are basically reaching to the stars. Now, one of the people I've left out of the narrative so far is somebody who spanned all these genres. Two people. Curtis Mayfield, James Brown. So why did I wait till the 70s to talk about them? Because they spanned in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. Because by the 70s, they had reached almost the epitome of a sound, which we call funk. They were often the progenitors. You also got to look at Curtis Mayfield as one of the people who influenced reggae. A lot of reggae musicians talk about Curtis Mayfield's guitar playing as being one of the biggest influence, that little cheap, cheap sound. Go back and listen to Minstrel and Queen, Curtis Mayfield singing, and his guitar playing on that song. You hear the roots of a lot of what became later reggae. So Curtis Mayfield and James Brown are two very interesting characters, spanning the 50s, the 60s, and 70s, starting out with the doo-wop and early R&B sound, moving through the 60s with the sounds of early funk, and then of course James Brown going with the deep funk where he turns the whole band into a percussive instrument. By the 70s, he's at the height of his powers in the early 70s. He's founding radio stations. He's making political statements. He's traveling to Africa. He's traveling to Central America. He's influencing artists across the waters like Fela Kuti and Afrobeat. He's basically created this mythic sound, this funk sound that goes deeper than anything we had heard before. Curtis Mayfield, yes?
How about Roy Ayers?
Always. But Roy Ayers is definitely part of that Earth, Wind, and Fire circle, along with Ronnie Laws as well. So there's so many we could name, and that's true. So, but Curtis and James, for me, seem like two variations on that thing because they are almost the epitome of a certain sound and what you could do with it. James was more Congo with his funk. It was very guttural, very percussive, very heavy. Even the vocals became grunts and chants. Curtis was more like the troubadour tradition, the Spanish Moorish tradition, songs to be sung to lovers, even the protest songs, very smooth voice, high falsetto. So but when he came to funk and what he brought to it, sound-wise, was something that was really running neck and neck with James Brown, I often feel. Now, we also have, at this time, a lot of powerful women coming out, creating music. Betty Davis, Miles Davis's ex, but she is a star child running with the best of them. P-Funk had nothing on her. And the things she was writing about and singing about in her music, this Aquarian star child, as she once described herself. You have artists like Melba Moore, you have Betty Wright, and remember the album covers that were coming out at this time as well, where you had these almost arabesque costumes that they were wearing. They were basically envisioning themselves as these almost kind of, I call it like these Afro space cadets. Everybody had the platform shoes, the glittering capes, Earth, Wind, and Fire, Melba, Betty Wright, whoever was costuming them, or were they costuming themselves? You always ask the question, was this something somebody was creating? So out of this 70s mix, you have all that going on. You have disco coming out, and you have disco good, disco bad, but it was part of a rhythmic dance tradition that had survived from early jazz through swing, through doo-wop. It's still surviving the need to move our bodies. Some of it went deep spiritually, some of it just was surface music, nothing wrong with that. So you have that going on as well. But around all this, you also have poets coming into the mix. Starting back in the late 60s, you have the last poets, bringing a very revolutionary aesthetic to the tradition by putting these vocal poems, these potent political vocal poems over drums, over beats. You have, of course, Gil Scott-Heron and what he's doing. And out of that tradition, you have something coming. You have these young men and women